Okay, so continuing our discussion of getting bigger, right? So last time we were talking about chemistry and molecules, and we talked about some rather large molecules, actually, right? We call them macromolecules because they're quite large. And so the next step, the next, place to go is to talk about cells. So this is another one that we're going to break up into pieces because, just to make it a little bit more manageable. Some of this, sorry, interruption. Uh, what was I going to say? Oh, some of the material that is some of the material here is really like basic and straightforward. So I'm going to try not to talk about that too much, just because if you read your book and you do your homework, you'll be fine. Other things are either not particularly well covered in your book, or they kind of need a little more. So I'm going to spend a little more time with that. One place that I actually want to start before we talk about cell diversity, different types of cells. Very first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about cell theory. Cell theory is a theory, much like the theory of evolution. And so I hope you recall way back from chapter 1 that in science, when we talk about theories, we are talking about things that have enormous amounts of evidence supporting them, not just, one experiment says this is true, right? But enormous amounts of evidence. They've stood the test of time. They are things that are falsifiable, but have not yet been falsified, right? So there are things that, could easily be proven otherwise, but that hasn't happened. And they're really just, well understood, and things that, have a lot of evidentiary support. How's that for fancy language? Right? So cell theory is the idea. It has two parts, sometimes three, depending on who you talk to. But one part, the first part, is all living things are made of cells. Right? Another way of thinking about that, well, I wouldn't even say that. So yeah, so all living things are made of cells, right? One or more, I should say cells, right? Because there are many organisms that are unicellular. They are made of only one cell, right? But all living things are made of cells. That's the first part of cell theory. The second part of cell theory states that all cells come from previously existing cells. Okay. Now, perhaps you're thinking back to when we were talking about macroevolution and we talked about the origin of life, and there was a four-part hypothesis that we spent a little bit of time talking through about how the first cells may have come to be. One of the reasons why that idea is at the level of hypothesis is that it has not been directly observed, nor do we have direct evidence that that's how things went down. Okay. Additionally, notice that part of cell theory, the second part of cell theory, is that all cells come from previously existing cells, because this is the only way that we have thus far observed production of a cell is from a previously existing cell. Okay, so even though we have all of these hypotheses about how you could get a cell by some other means, right? All that we have all that we've actually observed, right, is that cells coming from previously existing cells. And so we're going to talk about this more when we talk about cell division, and that's coming up pretty soon. Okay, so that's on the horizon. For now, though, it's just important to me that you know cell theory, right, the two parts of cell theory, and that you understand sort of what it's about. Okay. some of you might be thinking, having some concerns about the first part, all living things are made of cells. And so kind of park that in the back of your mind for later when we talk about some interesting things that aren't made of cells, but are, some people might think that they're alive. Just, how's that for a teaser? It's a terrible teaser. Okay. Anyway. Okay. One last thing, and this is not really directly part of cell theory, but one last thing is this idea that cells are the smallest units that have the characteristics of living things. Okay. Okay. So what are the characteristics of life? Well, this is another thing that we talked about way back in chapter 1, right? So if you go back to chapter 1 and talk about what were the different things we talked about. So for example, we talked about being ordered. We talked about ability to reproduce. We talked about evolution. We talked about maintaining internal conditions. We talked about responding to the environment. We talked about using energy, right? All of those kinds of things. Cells are the smallest units that do that. So while cells are definitely and obviously made of smaller particles, right? Molecules, okay? Those don't exhibit life, right? Those do not have the characteristics of life. Cells are the smallest units that exhibit the characteristics of life, okay? So with all of that kind of background, let's talk a little bit about the diversity of cells. This, some of this we also talked about way back in week 1 and 2 when we were getting started with doing our organism of the week. And you watched a little video and looked at a little PowerPoint that was talking about, well, which domains are which, right? And so there was a brief introduction to what a prokaryotic cell is versus a eukaryotic cell way back then. So a lot of this is essentially a repeat, but let's remind ourselves, right? Maybe pause for a second and remind yourself, what are the characteristics of prokaryotic cells? Okay, so maybe that's the first thing, is remind yourself what are the characteristics. And then the second thing is, which domains have cells that are prokaryotic? Okay, so if you need a minute to think about it, pause. I'll let you do that here. Okay, yeah. Okay, that was good. You paused. Nice work. Okay, so let's so let's list that stuff. So remember, the sort of big defining feature of prokaryotic cells is that they do not have a true nucleus. And so we'll talk more about the anatomy of a nucleus a little bit later. But the idea is that they have their DNA kind of wadded up in a pile. So it's usually together, right? But we call it a nucleoid region. We don't call it a nucleus because it doesn't have a membrane around the outside of it, right? And so that is like perhaps the biggest defining characteristic of prokaryotic cells. Secondly, it has no membrane-bound organelles. So you might be looking at this and you might be thinking, I see things there inside of the cell. They're not true organelles, okay? So no, for that matter, we haven't even talked about what an organelle is yet, okay? So no membrane-bound organelles. And then the other thing is prokaryotic cells typically are smaller and simpler than eukaryotic cells. So small and simple. Okay. Now, so that's the like 3 sort of big characteristics that makes a prokaryotic cell prokaryotic. And I would remind you too to think about what the word prokaryotic means. So karyo refers to what it literally translates to in Greek is kernel, like a kernel of corn or wheat or something. And so, but in cells, it means nucleus. So prokaryotic literally means pro means before. So it means before the nucleus, right? So these are the cells that evolved first. Yeah, prokaryotic cells. And they're still around. They must be really successful if they're still around today. Okay. So no nucleus. That's before the nucleus is what prokaryotic means. Okay. Now, what domains are we talking about for these guys, right? So remember, we're talking about domain bacteria and archaea. Okay. Right? So those are our two domains. Okay. So here's some cool diversity in prokaryotes. Another thing you will notice about prokaryotic organisms is that they're essentially all unicellular. So remember, unicellular means uni means one, like a unicycle has one wheel, right? So unicellular means one cell. So these organisms are not made of multiple cells, but then you're looking at a picture like this one and you're thinking, that looks like it's multiple cells. Sometimes they kind of clump and stick together, right? But each cell is fundamentally like an independent organism from one another, okay? So all of them are unicellular. All of them are obviously made of prokaryotic cells. Bacteria and archaea are different in the sense that they're different in a lot of ways, and we're not going to get into the ways that they're different because, quite frankly, a lot of that is super technical, and we're just not, you don't need to know that, so we don't care, okay? But one thing that might be kind of interesting to you is that archaea are often found in really interesting sort of extreme environments. So they can grow in places that are very, very hot or very, very acidic or, you know, all kinds of very, very salty, right? So most living things would die if they were exposed to too much salt. But there are archaeans that do just fine in super, super salty environments. So not all of them, but many live in really extreme environments. Okay. And then bacterium, I think that a lot of people, when they hear bacteria, their immediate like knee-jerk gut reaction is to think about bacteria that make people ill, right? Because it's like, ooh, I need this antibacterial product, or oh, I need to take antibiotics to kill this bacteria. Bacteria is scary. But quite frankly, there actually are many bacteria living inside and on the surface of your body that are tremendously beneficial to you. And quite frankly, you would be very sick without them. Very, very sick, right? This is one of the reasons why if you take certain antibiotics, you get like, you know, you get an upset tummy, you get a little diarrhea. Because what's happening is that antibiotic is killing some of the bacteria that lives in your gut, right? That actually helps your gut health, right? It helps you stay healthy. So we're learning more and more about how important, we call it our microbiome, right? How important our microbiome is, how important the bacteria are that live on our bodies. And so in addition to beneficial bacteria, there's also a lot of bacteria that are just like, they're just neutral, right? They're not beneficial, they're not harmful, they're just, you know, there. Okay. So right? So bacteria aren't necessarily the enemy, right? And in some cases, they're very, very important. And the number that live on in and on our bodies is like they outnumber our own cells, right? It's like a tremendous amount all over you. So the next time you're, you know, being a germaphobe, stop for a second and just think about all the bacteria that live on your body that make you healthy, right? And then, you know, go wash your hands because you don't want to get, you know, the virus, as my 5-year-old says, you don't want the virus, right? So practice good hygiene and be safe, right? It's a virus, not a bacterium, by the way. Okay, but anyway, but don't be too fearful, I guess is what I'm getting at. Okay, so that's prokaryotes. Okay, here's a little side-by-side comparison situation, right? Okay, then we have our eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic, remember, means you means true, right? And so I'm not going to bother writing these out because they're written right here. So typical eukaryotes have their DNA is inside of a nucleus. Their internal structures are organized into compartments. So those are our membrane-bound organelles. My computer's being weird. I think it's hot. It's being sort of laggy. Okay. They're larger and, oh wait, that's referring to that, but whatever. They're generally larger, they're generally more complex, right? So see all these different compartments and all this like stuff in here, right? A friend of mine likes to say that the way that she teaches it is she says that a prokaryotic cell is like a studio apartment where you do everything in the same room, basically. You know, you sleep, you eat, everything happens all in the same space. Whereas a eukaryotic cell is more like a large home that has different activities that happen in different compartments or different rooms. Okay, so anyway, right? You eat in the dining room. You prepare the food in the kitchen. You watch TV in the TV. I know, I don't follow any of those rules either, but you get what I'm saying. All right. Now, another thing that this chapter sort of focuses on, one of the things that it focuses on is it talks quite a bit about the difference between animal cells and plant cells. So you're going to see, so this is a generalized animal cell. It's also kind of a lie. And I say that because this gives the impression that like all animal cells look like this, and they don't, right? So depending on, you know, first of all, what animal we're talking about, and second of all, the various different types of tissues found within any animal, cells vary quite a bit. Okay, so this image is kind of like an idealized animal cell. It is not what the majority of the cells in your body actually look like. Okay, but they use this picture because it shows all the organelles, and isn't it pretty and cute? Okay, notice that the things that are labeled in pink, right, specifically are things that are unique to animal cells. Okay, it's not really that many. It's just the one. Okay, my video is laggy. I don't know why. Anyway, and then we have a similar picture here with a plant cell, right? And so once again, they are highlighting the structures in a plant cell that are found only in plants, not in animals. Okay, they're using green for that, which is nice. Okay, so that might be a useful thing to look at. Once again, I will remind you, this is an idealized plant cell. This is not what all plant cells look like. So, you know, just be prepared for that. Okay. All right. I think actually, oh, come on. Laggy, super laggy. Okay. So this is where I'm going to stop for this little video. Okay. And so in the next one, we're going to talk about cell membranes. Okay. And then we'll have another one that's about the nuclei of cells and the different organelles that are found inside of cells. Okay. So we're breaking it up into chunks again.